We shall not cease from exploring, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. T.S. Eliot. Well, Elspeth and I are here exploring and having a most wonderful time. Indeed, we find your city very much like London, full of life and full of interest, and we're finding our feet in it. I thought my wife was becoming Captain Flinders right away, according to that statue just along by St. Paul's, the way she strode up Swanston Street yesterday, creating a small bow wave as she went from store to store. I recognized a little bit of Australia in that move. But it was later on in the day, we walked over to the visitors center and saw a great Buddhist festival taking place, and there was a busker there. He said it was his first trick of the weekend, and he was sitting on the top of a 3-meter-high unicycle, and his final trick of the day was to juggle 3 swords while having one sword balanced on his head at the top of a 3-meter unicycle, leaving his hat at the bottom for people to put money into, and he was trying to control the crowd and trying to stop the flow of people interested in other things, and he was trying not to fall off his bicycle, and I thought to myself, that's me. That's me, that's the church. These days, hey, ladies and gentlemen, gather around, we can do this, you know how we can do this, watch how we keep our balance, please, sir, don't walk through here, they're in the middle of an act, don't you realize? I thought, that's me. That's what we have come to these days. Well, I have some encouragement for myself and hopefully for others, if indeed that is the state of transition in which we find ourselves. I bought a book once for $3 from a used book table. A good Scotsman liked to spend his money well. And it was a book by a man named Alan Watt, and I think the title was Liturgy and Myth, something like that. Perhaps the words were reversed. For $3, you don't take that much notice. But the first chapter was the keeper. It said that if you were to take the femur of a human being who lived tens of thousands of years ago and compared it to a modern femur, they would be identical. And then he went on to say, isn't it interesting to feel that the inner life, the deep, deep inner life we possess, and the way we engage the broad, broad world is also identical, that there is a commonness about that which goes down centuries and generations, and that when we come to certain places in our life where the need is great, it is out of that rich resource pool, unseen until that moment, that comes to our aid to help us. Well, I've kept the book and I read chapter 1 of it every so often because it is so incredibly rich. As we move along, even in times of change, somehow we are given what we need in this strange and mystical expanse of being a human being. I was going to call this little series Star Trek Quest for the Southern Cross. Bit trendy, don't you think? And the divisions were going to be station keeping. That's what the church tends to be doing these days where I live, just sort of holding its place and trying not to knock over any more of its moorings. And the second Sunday would be called maneuvering thrusters, where we actually move out and begin to do something. And then the last Sunday, if we last that long, would come to something called warp speed. But I changed my mind on that. Good title, though. If you ever ask me back some year, perhaps we can flesh out Star Trek Quest for the Southern Cross. But this series is called Crossroads in Uncharted Territory. We do live in uncharted territory. I don't know what's going to happen 1 minute from now. None of us does. And yet there are crossroads across it. I was called to conduct a funeral last week of someone I didn't know, and I arrived early just to make sure I knew where I was going, and I was alone in the minister's room, and it suddenly struck me that my wife and I were going to fly in a day or two all the way to Australia, and I got those terrible feelings in the pit of your stomach as if, Mummy, I've never done this before. And surprisingly, the words of a psalm came to me. I'm not a great quoter of psalms, but it was Psalm 121. I lift my eyes to the hills, And suddenly I saw the hills as being that whole series of events, the ones you can see, and then the ones you can't see, and then the ones beyond that and beyond that. I lift mine eyes to the hills. Mummy, I've never done this before. From whence does my help come? My help comes from the Lord. He will not let your foot be moved. He neither slumbers nor sleeps. I was greatly comforted by running across Psalm 121 when I was holding myself against an unknown future. Well, it's uncharted territory, but there are crossroads in it. That little psalm popping up in my mind gave me indication of that. And then I was thinking about the new faith. Well, faith is new every time. None of us has faith, at least of the intellectual kind or the life experience kind, when we're born. We just arrive, and luckily we may be held in loving arms, and we grow from there. We have 9 little grandchildren. The oldest is 7, and the youngest is about 6 months. And none of them came into the world with anything but a new faith, if they had a faith at all. They had faith that Mummy would be there and that Daddy would hold them, and that they would be fed when they were hungry and changed when that need arose. But they're thinking all the time, working on it. My mother-in-law passed away about a month ago, and my little 3-year-old granddaughter was talking to her mother about it, and she said, "Where is Grammy now?" Big question. And then my daughter said, "We say that she went to heaven." Well, will she be coming back anytime soon? Well, it's said that we come from heaven and we go back to heaven. You mean she's going to be born as a new little baby somewhere else? Well, there's a little girl working on her faith, and I may say her mother tends to be working on her faith after that conversation as well. Faith is always new to waves of doubt and faith. Sometimes we have it all together and the church is winning whatever battle we're in, and sometimes it's all falling apart and we are losing it. A friend of mine made me a stole, and he made the weave on it loose and tight, loose and tight. He's not a church-going person, never has been, but he said, "My understanding of congregational life is that sometimes you have it all together and sometimes you don't. So faith is always changing in the face of the headwind into which we are required to sail." And faith is always new in its application as to whether or not the community around us will support it or not, whether it thinks we are interesting and stirring, or whether it thinks we are simply strange and unusual people. You know, where I live, it's easier to get a community to support a food program to buy soup for people in need than it is to support a faith community to do things liturgical and spiritual and of intellectual significance. Public grants will support food banks to feed a person day after day, but will not support churches who are seeking to develop theological thought and deeper community and cultural understanding. Interesting, that's just the time we live in. And of course, faith is always new at the cutting edge of things. It's interesting to me that we spend our time looking backwards to see what they used to do 100 years ago and 1,000 years ago, rather than starting where we are now and looking forward to see what can be done, who is meeting us at the next entrance. And I always thought to myself how terrible it would be if we were turning our own guns on God's incoming angels. Wouldn't that be a terrible thing to happen? So faith is always at the cutting edge. It's the living generation that is the color of coral. The generations beneath simply hold the living generation up so that it may live in its time and place under the brightness of the sun. So there is uncharted territory and there are crossroads, and when the crossroads cross, new faith grows and has meaning. The idea of crossroads or crosshairs is important to John Dominic Crossan. I was reading one of his books. He is the man who really cracked my faith open like a peach. He said for him it's necessary to have a series of crosshairs, and when they cross you pay attention. The first one has to do with the story itself. Does the story itself appear anywhere else within the scriptural text? Is it deemed important to the first community that is setting the canon? And the second crosshair is it mentioned anywhere else outside the text? Is there anything else like it in the common world? And the third is its staying power. Are other people raising the same issue and theme in their life, generation after generation? And he illustrated with the beheading of John the Baptist, the story with which we began the gospel today. And John Dominic Crossan says the story probably isn't true in a sense that we think John the Baptist was beheaded. Indeed, it simply says that he died in the Machaerus prison at the hands of Herod. But there was another story circulating in the ancient world of another man who was beheaded by a ruler. And Crossan suggests that the gospel writer included the story then just to say that's what power always does to those who are struggling to be faithful like us in the church. You have to watch power because at first opportunity for its own reasons, it will cut your head off. I thought that was a very interesting way of looking at the text. I look at others that way as well. So this is a 3-sermon series called Crossroads in Uncharted Territory, and next week is called Where Valley Meets Mountain, and the last week is called Where Your Road Meets the Great Road. But this week, it's called Where the Land Meets the Water. There's a big difference between the land and the water. You live on the land, you can't live well in the water. You're familiar with things on the land, but you can't be overly familiar with things on the water, or else you could drown. We have a cottage back in Canada on the edge of one of the Great Lakes, and every spring, our spring being now, our children go to put the dock out, and we have one of those black interconnecting plastic docks that you have to hook up, and it's so heavy that every year we break it into two, store it on the dock until the ice goes out, and then put it back in. And every year my son finds himself with one foot on one piece of it and one foot on the other, and the two pieces floating apart. And every year he falls in. And every year I go to help him, and every year I fall in. And every year we both laugh and swear to sell the cottage at the end of the season. And it indicates to me that I'm very, very good on my feet on the land, but not quite so good on my feet at the water. And water is that strange place where new things come along and you're just slightly off your balance, where the land meets the water, where you know what you're doing and suddenly you don't know what you're doing, can be a crossroad, a place to pay attention in uncharted territory. And there are lots of places where the land touches water in our experience. The first is our birth. We haven't done this before, and suddenly here we are, a place to pay attention. And then the first touch and the first response. There's a place to pay attention. And the first steps we take, watch out for cars. Don't step out between parked cars. Hold on to Mummy's hand, Daddy's hand. Your first word. Well, I never thought a child of mine would say that word out loud. And your first love. New ground. And your first loss. And your first reversal of fortune. And your first experience of death. You were so sure of everything until these moments where the land meets the water. Well, the texts read this morning illustrate the power of the crossroads in individual lives where the land meets the water. Remember the story of Jacob? A terrible fellow, really. Lots of time is spent on him, but a terrible fellow. You wouldn't want him living next door to you. His mother had a very, very difficult pregnancy, carrying twins, and she was heard to say out loud, if I ever get rid of these two, I'll never, ever have another child in my life. That has to affect you when you're listening inside, and this is your world. And of course, he was second born, and that does something to you too. Came out holding the heel of his brother. And all through his life, he was striving. He was surrounded by angels ascending and descending, and he never saw them because he was so busy striving. And his personal land word, where he was in control of things, was the word mine. Mine, it's mine. You see those sheep, Laban, my father-in-law, they're mine. Do you see your youngest daughter, Rachel? She's mine. He had to work 7 years and marry the wrong daughter and ended up with both daughters, but he kept them both. And the household gods, he kept them as well, all the way through. They're mine. You see this land? It's all mine. Land, mine. Land, mine. Land, mine. And before long, he was stepping on landmines all over his life. But he ran into that moment where land meets water, and his water word became flow, the word flow, because the Jabbok stream where he crossed literally means flow. He came to the flow. He got into the flow of things for the first time. Go with the flow, as the expression says. People have lived beside the Jabbok River for 9,000 years, and it has flown since eternity. And there is Jabbok wrestling with something where the flow meets the landmines of his life, where the land meets the water. And he wrestles in the dark, and he is alone, and he uses dirty tricks, and his opponent uses dirty tricks, and he tries out to get the upper hand. Tell me your name. If I have your name, I'll have your nature. Says the Spirit, no name for you, but I'll give you a new name. No longer will you be called usurper, for that's what his name meant. I take, it's all mine. Now you will be called one who wrestles with significant life things and survives. That's quite a name change, isn't it? And he knew that when he was in the flow of things, things felt different for him for the first time in his life. Land and water met, and it was a significant crossroad for him. Well, the text also showed the power of crossroads in a culture. We read the story of the community of faith on that little hillside recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. We are a community of faith that carries a gem in our heart that few people seem to want. Isn't that fabulously frustrating at some point? We have the most remarkable story to tell, and the most remarkable set of experiences of encountering the holy in the lives of one another, and so few people want to hear it. You can silence a room, empty a room, just by mentioning the name Jesus in it, if it's full of strangers. Well, either that or you get the ones who hand you the tracts and say, read this, brother, sister, and then you leave the room immediately after that. So we have a gem in the center nobody wants, and we have a truth at the center that few of us will risk in terms of seeing where it will actually go. And the way of life we set forward is deemed irritating by so many people. You're always sort of sanctimoniously on guard for the world. You never lighten up, you people of faith. Well, and then, of course, there's a temptation for all of us to drift. My wife was saying, look at all the wonderful Sunday brunch opportunities there are in Melbourne. Do we have to go to church every week? It's interesting to me that the texts of the late New Testament concern themselves with trying to keep the congregation from drifting away. Make sure you're here next Sunday is the underlying text of the late Pauline letters. Well, the community land word in the story is the word power. We want to know, as people of faith, where the power is in life. Herod has the power to kill the great spirits who give us leadership. And yet there is word on the street that there's another power at work in this young Galilean carpenter, and we're asking where the power is. Do the politicos have the power? Is that where it rests among us in our culture? Does public opinion win the day? Do life and death and their terrors have the power for us? Is that where they are in our life? Our desire to belong and to thrive, is that where the power rests over our heads? Is it the ability to eat when we're hungry and drink when we're thirsty and feel safe when we're frightened? Is that where we need to go to serve the power that lives? The land word is power. But there was another power within the powers, so the story went, set Herod on edge, set him watching, and sent all those people racing to that hillside of which we read. And the water word for the community when they got there was the word presence. Presence, there's something here that feeds and nourishes. Oh, we don't have much and we're not in charge of very much at all, but there is something that guides and holds and nurtures us all the way, and we want it and we hunger for it. You see, those people were gathering right next to the water, and you know what the name of the sea was? the Sea of Tiberias. The Romans were everywhere. The cultural power of the empire was everywhere. And here they are, just like we are, huddled on the shore of someone else's empire, seeking to be fed by another power in the smallest and most delightful of ways. And then later in the story, there we are again, out on the sea, seemingly all alone, pulling against heavy winds and high waves, and suddenly, to our amazement, one whom we have sought and loved and thought we had lost is there, walking upon the very storm we fear, and calls us out to go, calls us to step out. And some of us go out in our heroic moments and we fall flat on our faces. Well, we do that as people of faith, but then we're scooped up and put into the boat, and suddenly that storm is over. That storm surge is over for the moment, and we find ourselves within a companionship that is unshakable. We have one another's company, and we shall live to row and fight and feed another day. So our water word is presence. We live with a presence. And so, across uncharted territory, where you cross the roads, where land and water meets, you begin to see meaning for yourself, for ourselves. We are swamped in an adulterated culture full of other things, and yet we are finding day by day the guts and the moments to carry on. I have a friend at home who lost his wife. They had been university sweethearts, and he loved her very much, and he was totally at loose ends for a year and a half. One day he came to my office and said, a flyer blew up against my door the other day, advertising an engineering conference at an English cathedral, and I'm a retired engineer, so I thought maybe I'd go just to try to get away from my broken heart. And so he made arrangements, and the day before the flight he came to me. He said, I have the strangest feeling about this flight. I said, do you mean it's going to crash? Oh, no, he said, just a very strange feeling about this whole thing. I said, well, make sure you tell me what happens. Well, back he came. It was the most remarkable thing. I went to the cathedral, was introduced to the woman who organized the event, and when she turned around, she was the spitting image of my dead wife. The spitting image of her. As a matter of fact, I was so stunned, after a few moments, she said, are you all right? He said, I'm not all right at all. And we talked for a while, and I showed her pictures of my first wife from my laptop, and the dean of the cathedral came through and took a look over my shoulder and said, oh my God. Well, later on that day, the woman said, I'd like my husband to see these pictures. Would you phone tomorrow and come to our house? And he said, certainly. So the next morning he called, and he met the husband over the phone. And the husband said, yes, you're the gentleman with the pictures. I have to tell you that my wife died last night. And my friend said, she died? He said, yes, she died last night. She's been ill for a long time, and she felt she didn't want to go to the cathedral yesterday, but felt she had to go. And when she came home, she said to me, as soon as I saw his face, I knew that's the reason I had to be there. And we talked about you all night, and this morning she died. I wonder, he said, if you would meet my daughter in London about a week from now after the service, just to speak to her. And so a week later, my friend met this young woman in front of the London Tube, and up from the underground she came. He said, the spitting image of my first wife when we met in university. And we had lunch together, and at the end of the lunch, she said, my mother told my father to give you a message. And the message was, anyone who has loved as you have is going to be all right. He said, I felt like $1 million. Later on, upon reflecting on it, several months later, I said to him, well, what do you make of it? He said, I've had this experience 4 times in my life. When I turned in the line at the football game at university and saw my wife standing behind me and saying, that's the woman I'm going to marry. And then when our son was killed and we were at the funeral home and all his friends were milling around, and she caught my eye across the room and smiled. And then when I met the woman in the cathedral, and then when I met her daughter, 4 times. And I may never have it again, and I don't need to have it again. What do you think it is? I said. I believe it's the love of God, said my friend. We live in uncharted territory, and every day is new, but there are crossroads where the land, the sure things meet the water, places we are unsure, and when we pay attention there, we find ourselves companioned by something so rich and so mighty that we are encouraged to step out today and tomorrow and forever.